So I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Reverend Dr. Nathan Hosler. So Dr. Hosler is the director of the Church of the Brethren's Office of Peacebuilding and Policy and a pastor at the Washington City Church of the Brethren congregation on Capitol Hill. He's previously served as the peace coordinator of the National Council of Churches USA and also worked with the peace program of the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria and taught peacebuilding practice and theology at the Colt Bible College in Northeast Nigeria. So I'm incredibly interested in what he will share with us today. I've heard great things about you, so I will let you take the floor. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be with you. I will not have slides, so if that affects how people orient themselves in gallery or spotlighting, feel free to adjust accordingly. As noted, I'm Nathan Hosler and have been working in DC now for about 10 years. I started my work in Northeast Nigeria with the Church of the Brethren there, which has been there since the 1920s. We were planning to go and help support the peacebuilding work. And then while working on our visa processes, the first Boko Haram attacks happened, which during that time was one of their largest, or their largest church was destroyed. And a number of the people were displaced, which led to many years of and continued insecurity and violence towards their community and broadly. So this affects how I think about this work. The first, and I think this kind of frames how I'm thinking about this work, and so I'll give a little bit of a bit more explanation of that. So, as noted, we're part of the Global Church of the Brethren. There's no overarching structure, so they're nationally oriented. So there's Church of the Brethren in Nigeria and the U.S. I work for the U.S. We were seconded to the Nigerian church, and we were going because they're interested in expanding a peace building project. We were just finishing our graduate studies and were asked to come, and we're working our visas, and Boko Haram happened. And so we went almost exactly a month after the first attacks into Northeast, and discovered when we got there that we were already on the schedule for that semester, which had already started. And so I said, well, I guess we'll just kind of jump right into this. And so a week after arriving, having only visited once before, I showed up in a class and said, well, we'll read the scriptures together, which points to a traditional Church of the Brethren practice in many churches of reading together and discerning together. And I said, the classic text when you think of peace building and nonviolence in the Church of the Brethren and the broader church is when Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And so I started reading this, and I said, I don't assume that I know the answer of what this means in your context or for me. I can leave if I need to, though I'm, to Anna's point, in some amount of risk in this context, but I have the opportunity to get out. I have resources to get out, and I'm not going to try to impose it in some sort of, I know the answer that I should give to you, but we need to work at, you've said you follow Jesus, and you've said you're part of the Church of the Brethren. And so as this, we need to figure out how we read this text and live out this text in this particular context of both great risk and all sorts of layers of governance questions. So within the Church of the Brethren, I won't give you the answer to how we came out on that, but it was an interesting and lively discussion over about 2 years. Within the broader Christian tradition, there are roughly 3 streams of thoughts, which of course are very diverse within them. Historic peace churches are pacifism. So Church of the Brethren, Mennonites, Quakers, as well as a range of other folks that might align but not be formally in that space. A newer articulation through like the World Council of Churches, for example, of the just peace. So this is not quite pacifist, is not quite just war in the traditional sense, and then the just war tradition. All of these raise questions and try to answer questions around, is it possible for Christians to participate in the use of lethal force? This is usually defined within the nation state and geopolitics, but can we participate in some sort of violence for a just cause or unjust cause? How do we think about this? Just peace particularly tries to push this question out, not just from the question of can we or can we not participate, but how do we work for peace? The Church of the Brethren is within this historic peace church or pacifist position as work to, I think this, to the earlier comment, this comes out of a process of discerning. So the Church of the Brethren emerged out of a context of religious violence, the 30 Years' War and religious violence in Europe. And so both said, we see Christians aligning with the state and participating in violence against each other. This does not seem good. So they work to rehabilitate or get back to an earlier church understanding of um, following Jesus, as well as this very real context of we're reading this and doing this in a context of violence, and we're called to live and concretely engage. This has developed in a range of ways. Initially, this was perhaps a bit more looking at these questions of participating or not participating. So saying, as Christians who are committed to peacemaking, we cannot participate in violence against other Christians or against people generally. And so there's a sort of stepping back. This gradually worked and began to develop in our discernment of if we're going to be opposed to something, how do we work for it? And so then more elaborate theories or theologies or discernment about active peacemaking came out. And so I've recently just returned from the World Council of Churches Assembly. We were part of the beginning of the World Council of Churches in the U.S., globally, and the National Council of Churches in the U.S. as a very practical way to, if we're going to be against something, war, and work to address conflict and violence, we also need to work actively for peace. So this includes ecumenical and interfaith relations, very practical ways in our community. I think another piece that goes also to the comment to Anna is this process of discerning and figuring out what it means for us to live this, this theology and this theological ethics in very practical ways. I'm going to highlight three ways where I think are the more nuanced and deep reflection shape our practical engagement, and how this then plays into my work in policy advocacy here in DC. So the first I'll highlight, and I'll drop these the links to the statements in the chat afterwards. I don't want to distract you now by looking at things. And I also don't want to mess around with anything. The first is around, we had in 2013, after discernment in my office and a broader discussion, we have a resolution opposing US drone policy. This reiterates our ongoing commitment to peace and working against violence. One of the interesting pieces I'd like to highlight in this is tying it to the incarnation, and within Christian theological terms, the idea of God coming close in Jesus and coming to heal us is at core of how we understand our ministry in this world. Our tagline is continuing the work of Jesus. And so we understand ourselves participating with this work of healing. And the statement makes a connection between following Jesus who came close to heal, and drones policy and action by the US, which not only commits violence against communities and individuals, but does this from a distance. And so not only is there a harm caused, but it's harm even at the reduction to perhaps very low reduction actual harm to or risk to soldiers. And so this, of course, ties into all sorts of historic connection and reflection on within the Christian tradition on the willingness of soldiers, international law, willingness of soldiers to take on risk, and that's part of their vocation, part of their work. And by reducing that, this somehow fundamentally shifts the calculus and the willingness to use force. And so this paper refers to this incarnation, the central theological ethical understanding for us, ties it as a counterpoint to US drone policy, then invites us to oppose this. I think the statement also highlights a really, to me, maybe it's because I do the work or I'm a theologian, but to me, a really interesting piece of, we have this history of not participating and in some ways separating ourselves out, but there's also throughout our statements historically, a strong affirmation of finding very practical ways to work. So for example, while we would say our ethical reflection is not fully articulated in international law, and in a statement on nonviolence and humanitarian action, for example, we reaffirm saying, we affirm efforts of international law to reduce and limit harm and have accountability to it. In a similar way for this drone statement, we make the distinction, which seems a little bit odd again for, at least to me, a little bit odd. I was also part of the writing, so pointing towards myself, I guess, seems a little bit odd that we distinguish between drone usage in places of active war or stated war and places where we're not actively at war. So it's pointing, for example, to our drone strikes in Pakistan. And so, again, it's a distinction that we're not for drone strikes in war, but we recognize in contexts where there's low or very limited or no transparency, that this makes accountability harder and thus makes the possibility of harm greater. And so we even while having this strong rejection of the use of violence, have these one might say more nuanced or sort of somewhat more flexible ways of engaging. The second kind of big theological point I'll highlight and see how it ties into policy work and broader peace building is we have a statement from, don't have the year in front of me, and we've reiterated it throughout multiple iterations, the statement that all war is sin, which relates actually very similar to the statement from the first World Council of Churches, which was immediately after the Second World War. And that they say war is contrary to the will of God. We are maybe a bit stronger. All war is sin. So, highlights perhaps that we cannot participate in any way. And some people have said that having statements like this should preclude people like me from engaging in policy discussions around foreign policy, because it somehow, doesn't allow us to honestly engage, in discussions around possible foreign policy objectives. And obviously, since I've been doing this work for a while, I disagree with that, and so does our church. But we would say, not only does this provide a sort of a form of policy guidance for us and sort of parameters for our work, but these sorts of assumptions are form much, or if not all, of how we think about we being U.S. population broadly, and perhaps world broadly, think about war and fighting generally. And so, that we say we cannot do this in many contexts in DC, at least I hear it somewhat regularly, there's assumption that either you do nothing or you do war. So like, I believe it was President Obama during Libya said, well, we can't just do nothing. So the option was we can go in and, do war. It's a dichotomy in this assumption that, well, peacemaking, when it doesn't work, then we just go and, get around to fighting, which we know works. But this clearly doesn't work, or at least doesn't consistently work. And even if it would work in some, form of, say halting a particular atrocity, that doesn't really mean that it has worked per se. It means that maybe it met a particular policy objective for a minute, but the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan highlights the failure of war broadly and the necessity of other means specifically. So all war is sin is a policy parameter for us, and also invites us to challenge the assumptions that underlie and bolster assumptions around U.S. foreign policy and violence generally. And then the third one I'll note is, actually I kind of hit that already. We have the process of discernment, and I highlight this in relation to international law. We have this policy and discernment of, while we have theological statements and we have theological statements, this does not pull us back from engaging and finding ways to work with people across the political spectrum. I think this relates both to ICRD's work in the US presently, finding ways to work across divides, as well as nonviolent peace force and all of these discussions for that matter. So even though we have a very, one could say in quotes, pure objection to war and necessity of peacemaking, we work regularly in all manner of contexts that, and with partners that we don't agree with and who clearly don't match our narrowly defined or more narrowly defined sort of policy descriptions or understanding. I mean, this of course raises, which doesn't mean we just do everything without discernment again. So for example, there's a very active question. I was at a US Institute of Peace policy discussion with Africa Command some years ago. And in this context, AFRICOM, US military engagement in Africa, was very interested in saying, well, we can work with peace builders. We want to work with peace builders. We don't only do kinetic. We don't only do, use of lethal force. We do all sorts of other things. You should work with us. And so this opens a question: is if there was in fact something that US military was doing in Nigeria, for example, where we work, that we thought what we were potentially supportive with, would we think it reasonable to work with them? What are the implications of that? Can we take US government money to do humanitarian response in Nigeria? These are very active questions that are, usually defy easy answer. So I think I'm about 15 or 17 minutes. I'll pause now. Welcome any pushback or questions or comment. I think there was something in the chat which I didn't read yet, so I'll look at that next as well.
Well, thank you for your insight and comments so far, Dr. Hosler. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, sure. Miriam, can I ask, please, from Hosler?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, I can give you a reference of Reverend studies, where I have come to a conclusion when and how peace is established all over the world. If you look into different political contexts, especially in Middle Eastern and different South Asian context, especially the context of India and Pakistan, when our peace was disturbed, it was only due to the foreign interference between different nations, especially the study of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, The Myth of Independence. And it was a further extension from divide and rule to the unite and rule. And when there was an effort to bring Roman peace, so the peace was disturbed. So the new situation that is called now the neo-colonialism in the context, in the new political situation that has evolved after the Second World War, and India and Pakistan was called for the new Cold War, and the situation was described as the assassinated Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He said that West has tried to bring a peace through the Roman peace type model. So everywhere we see when there is a debate of peace all around the world, and the original stakeholders have to involve the third party, and especially the Western arbitration is prominent in the post-Cold War context. So how it is possible that peace can be originally built and the narrative of peace can originally be built while keeping the Middle Eastern context, especially of the Egyptian, of the Tunisia. So especially in the Rohingya concept, in the Rohingya Muslims were thrown out and treated very badly, and all around the world the peace has been a real issue, and I don't think, and I can give you a different other studies, especially S.D. Money, a Singaporean professor, his article on conflicts in South Asia, peace prospects and issues. So his article is very prominent. Srinath Raghuvan's study, the history of US in South Asia is very important, and especially the book by Lajpat Rai. He wrote in 1928 when his book was written in one of book by Catherine Bayo. She was an American journalist, and she tried to publish his book with the name Mother India, and his book with Unhappy India. Unhappy India was an India that was focusing on the division between Muslims and Hindus. So his whole narrative was, so divide and rule has been transformed into unite and rule, right? So we have come to a conclusion that especially bring focus on doing something else than bringing the Roman peace. Thank you very much. What do you think about that?
Well, there's much to comment on and respond to, so I'll try to do some justice to it. I think within Christian theology and sort of scriptures, we have the image and the idea of the body of Christ, and the idea is that all people who are part of the body have something to do and something useful to do and contribute, and not everyone does everything, and none of us can do everything, and all of us can do something. I think it might be stretching the category a bit, but when we think about peacebuilding, I think this also relates to how we think about the necessity of engaging. So, for example, when we look at, say, a context of local conflict or geopolitical struggle or, actual, hot war, looking at what are the ways where we get at both, say, civilian protection, which we've talked about today. How do we get at building the possibility for post-war reconciliation, justice, and healing? What are the global or large geopolitical situations historical? And so, I can't just come in as an American and say, well, why don't you just get it together? We can also, help, mediate this, but without recognition that the U.S., often U.S. policy has contributed. We can assess in each case whether it was positive or negative, but there's, often some form of U.S. or colonial engagement that usually is destabilizing. So one thing I've been focusing a lot recently is on U.S. weapons trade and arms sales. And what are the implications of this, and what's my, as an American citizen, culpability in this, in our system, which so readily exports tools of violence, which then not only affect the particular situation. So very clearly in the news right now is these major sales and transfers to Ukraine, which is clearly an act of aggression. So many people say this is justified, as a way to have limited support or somewhat limited support. But a question that one can raise after this is or in the midst of it is, while doing this at great speed, we being the US have also limited our typical mechanisms, which are already fairly minimal, for tracking and seeing what will happen after this particular war. And so these weapons will exist, and they will continue to circulate and create instability. And so I guess it's a sort of a second comment, perhaps rather than answering a question, but both looking at the sort of large geopolitical and policy implications, at least for mine as the US, but also this is for many nations, as well as supporting very local and regional efforts to address both the presence of conflict and violence, but also the healing after that. It's quite necessary.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hosler. Yeah, I think that's a great answer from you in trying to respond to these issues with the appropriate context and understanding the places that we come from, whether it's national or religious. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I can ask. I was interested. So we've heard a lot about kind of throughout the 3 days, ways to approach peace building and nonviolence initiatives, largely motivated by faith, right? And so I'm interested to learn how you, maybe personally or overarching the Church of the Brethren, kind of approach issues or communities. And maybe this is, expanding on what Bilal was just asking, but responding to crises that maybe come about with context of other faiths or communities of other faiths, and how, if any, do you guys feel a responsibility to get involved or respond to those issues, or are requested to respond? How does that kind of play out, those kind of conflicting, or not conflicting, but contrasting faiths, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so as noted, we initially we were both we leaned towards the non-participation in violence, but also had a very strong historically component of serving others in areas of service. And so this is played out. I'll give you a few historic examples and maybe a present example. So one, for example, someone named Dan West was a Church of the Brethren person who was doing humanitarian relief during the Spanish Civil War, and kept seeing we're bringing all this food in. It's kind of limited in what we can do. The need keeps expanding, and he said, I don't know if I can get the quote exactly right, but he said, to effect, if we found out a way to help both keep contributing and working to help, but also found ways to help other people kind of help and address themselves in their own context, this would be more important for and a longer implication. So he started what eventually became called Heifer International, which does development work. The idea initially was you bring a heifer who then has a baby. And so the family keeps the one cow, and then the cow gets passed on. So you pass on the gift. And so it's a build-in of agency. And so this, where it's interesting how this is that then, cedes control of the resource to someone else in a very important and local way. And that was done, without, you don't control who gets it, and you both work to expand. And so this is I don't think we've always done, issues of power well necessarily, but I think this is an interesting way of not trying to control the process, but also trying to empower and work to give agency. Another was around during the Armenian genocide. We officially didn't have any official church mechanism to work internationally. And people basically said, well, we really need to do something. And even though we don't have official policy that lets us do this, we're going to just do it. And you kind of make the policy after the fact. And so there's this long tradition. Again, I guess I always add this caveat. We, at times don't do it all that well. Long tradition of trying to follow the spirit. And, that gives some flexibility perhaps in how we engage. And so, many people have attested to doing work with what used to be Christian peacemaker teams, now community peacemaker teams, and coming face to face with people who are from very different traditions, both religiously and within the church, and also from no faith tradition, and how this reshaped how they thought about, but how both it strengthened their own identity, but in a sort of non-combative way. It helped them to think through it and engage more practically and generously, one might say. Not that it quite answers the question.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think you touched on something really important, this idea of agency building. And, there is so much value in a long-standing history of service and giving resources to people. And I think that's very relevant and important. But this also idea of empowering communities or individuals to obtain the agency and sustain that moving forward, I think that's so important too. And I really like that you addressed that. Let's see, we have like a minute for your time. So I don't know if anyone else has any questions or comments, or if you want to kind of give any more insights or any more comments before we kind of shift over to the next spot. Or if James, you want to say anything, I saw your face pop up.
No, I just wanted to thank Nate again for being with us and for the work that you do and for sharing the insights, as a fellow Peace Church member. It's great to have you here, and it's great to reconnect. We've been trying to do stuff, I know, for a while, particularly in South Sudan. So hopefully we'll still have that opportunity. Thank you very much, brother. Take good care. I would like to ask Mariam if you think we have the ability to play Friar Markovich's choir piece that we were unable to earlier. I think that'd be a nice way to transition maybe into the breakout discussions.
Sure, absolutely. So it's a 5-minute clip. So let me share and play that. And then for those of you this might be your first day with us, we will be doing kind of a breakout session for 25 to 30 minutes after I show this clip, and I'll assign breakout rooms, and you will have the opportunity to unmute, turn on your camera if you wish, and start chatting and conversing and networking with everyone. So if you're interested in that, please stick around. But let's pull up the video. All right. Please let me know if you can hear.
Monsieur le Président de la République française, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers amis, cher Président Jacques Chirac, c'est dans cette église de Saint-Antoine à Sarajevo que le chœur Pontanima est né. Malheureusement, Pontanima ne peut pas être avec vous aujourd'hui, et c'est la raison pourquoi nous avons voulu enregistrer spécialement pour vous, et ici même, un chant unique de 4 paradigmes religieux, un chant d'amour et de respect pour l'autre. Place à notre cœur Pontanima.
Wow, that was beautiful. I loved that. Thank you so much for sharing, Friar Markovich. And I noticed you were in the center. That's amazing. That was great. So yeah, at this time, I think if everyone is ready, we can do the breakout rooms. James or Martine, do you have any comments you want to say before you break everyone up?
I would just like to thank everybody again, all the speakers, our team members who put this together. Mariam, obviously your leadership on getting this all up and going, but everyone else who is here, who's helped, and those who came over the 3 days to share ideas and to listen and think together and hopefully uplift one another in this effort to bring some peace to a troubled world. So thank you all for being part of that network and part of that work. I think it gives us a lot of strength to know that we're all here together. And I think that this is just the first of what ICRD hopes to do around different aspects of this work. I think too many of us focus on what we're trying to do in the communities and forget to share our stories with one another and share our stories with others who need to hear that there are other things happening outside of the news cycle that just emphasizes what is negative, that there's so much hope and aspiration and positive intention that we can latch onto and maybe participate in a little bit. So my gratitude is boundless to all of you. I will step back and invite Martine, please, also to share some words on behalf of ICRD, but please know that we are deeply, deeply grateful and we look forward to the next time.
Great, thank you, James. And I just want to echo James's appreciation for everyone's engagement and passion and dedication in this space, particularly given turbulent times that we're seeing, and how important it is that we come together as a peace community to work for positive steps forward and positive change. And just echoing, some of the voices here today, as Venerable Napan said, rather than standing at a distance, stand closer so you don't shout. And you become and engage more effectively with our neighbors, essentially. One note to also make, and just to echo what James was saying about next steps, we will be doing more of these. I will actually be traveling. Some of us will be traveling to Oman next week for a discussion around the role of women and negotiation with a small cohort. And that's in collaboration with U.S. Institute of Peace. And we hope to do one in the future that looks at the role of women peace negotiators in this space. Tomorrow, actually, we do have another session with Alliance for Peacebuilding that looks at the role of religious actors in Track 1 peace processes. Gary Mason will be there with us. Some of you saw Gary the first day. Venerable Napan will be with us. Palawa Hasha Hassan from Afghanistan will be there talking about her experience in Afghanistan. And then we'll also have Aisha, a good colleague from Georgetown, who will be talking about some of the research we conducted. So if anyone is interested in that, we can put a link into, Miriam is already ahead of me, and put a link into the chat box. So just to flag that as well. So we hope to see you there and hope to see you in the future. And thank you for all that you do. Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks, Martine. Yes, so I'll open the breakout rooms now. There is no obligation to stay, but of course, I think it's valuable to, if you're interested in continuing these conversations, making new connections, take advantage of this. And like Martine and James said, we are going to continue to developing new events, ideas, platforms for us to continue these conversations, build these cross-cultural, cross-faith connections, and continue all the work that we're doing. Let me stop the recording.